Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025, and today we're talking about water and pH, land restoration, hopefully not the final, but definitely the most important frontier, and how to pick a ripe melon off the vine. So let's do it. All right, welcome to Tilth Tuesday. Every Tuesday this year will be brought to you by our friends at Tilth Soil. If you're looking for a compost or propagation mix, check out tilthsoil.com. Link will be in the show notes. I hope everyone is off to a decent start this week. Been lively around here with soccer season coming up and summer growing season still doing its thing. Usually there is a staleness to late July where the grasses are senescing and everything is getting dry and brown. But not so much this year. A nice change of pace, really, but don't worry, we still have time to get really, really dry here before the end of the year, so that's fun. In 2016, I remember it didn't rain from like September until December, and the cover crops that we sowed on our new property at the time all germinated extremely late, which made a mess of the spring. So I take no rain for granted. That's kind of the lesson here. Anyway, reminder, tomorrow is our live show at 9 a.m. Eastern to celebrate our 200th episode. That's right, this is episode 199. Isn't that wild? Our 200th episode of the show. And no, 9 a.m. is not necessarily the most convenient time for everyone, but just the way it worked out for us this week. So I hope to see a handful of you all there tomorrow. And by there, I mean here on YouTube at the No-Till Growers channel. Make sure you are subscribed so it pops up in your feed. Should be fun times. This may be more convenient for those of you across the pond than, say, California, this 9 a.m. start time, but it will be interesting to see who all shows up. And Mike will be helping with the questions, so save your questions for that day and then shout Mike out in the comments section tomorrow. Yeah, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Okay, so as I mentioned yesterday, I'm on the hunt for cool, large-scale ecological solutions to things like desertification, but really any sort of ecological restoration. In this weekend, I dove into a few really cool ones, which we will discuss over time. I find a lot of inspiration in those stories, but not just like general inspiration. I mean technical inspiration, like cool ideas for small-scale land management. Anyway, if you come across anything that I should cover and look into, let me know in the comments. But this weekend, I was reading about and watching videos about stories ranging from, restoration in the Gobi Desert to various areas of Australia, China, Nigeria, New Zealand, and beyond. Millions and millions of restored acres all over the world, and including the U.S. And one thing I find satisfying and beautiful, beyond all the way these projects look in the photos, is the sort of simplicity, at least in the implementation of the ecological restoration, but also the fact that there is no one right way to do it. Context is as important to restoring the land as it is to growing vegetables, but it seems there are also many ways to do it within a given context, which also is not unlike gardening. There are, without a doubt, some basics. It seems you have to get the hydrology right. That's key. Water is pivotal, but how that looks will be different in every region. Maybe it's slowing a creek down to allow for greater infiltration of the water that's coming down it, or maybe it's building ponds or catchments on slopes, such as swales, among other systems, or maybe in wetter regions or oceanic regions, it's plants helping to hold water in storms back. There have been huge projects, for instance, and to restore the marshlands outside of the levees in Louisiana to reduce the risk of storm surges, which also increases habitat. Win-wins also seems to be a theme of these projects, especially in drier regions where vegetation can be slow growing. Preventing overgrazing may be a primary focus, allowing the vegetation to recover before introducing any sort of grazing back. In other situations, grazing strategies may be the centerpiece. Incorporating biodiversity is an enormous sort of theme here. So in most instances, native plants are restored through plantings, and in others, it makes sense to allow the native vegetation to restore itself, or combinations of the two. Local indigenous knowledge is often employed, or it absolutely should be, as excluding native populations and knowledge can lead to project failures because they don't understand the landscape, as well as political or social tensions. In that vein, there are also complicated political challenges within restoration projects, permitting issues, litigation, and a big reason why some large-scale ecological projects fail is because the red tape just gets to be too much. And this, in fact, just this last week happened in Louisiana for one of these projects called the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion Project. Another thing you see within successful large-scale ecological restoration projects is the benefits to the local populations and the local economies when the plan is well thought out and well executed, bringing abundance back to those areas. abundance in food, abundance in water, abundance even in people returning to the land to live on it and work on it. A good restoration project restores the entire ecology, including the humans. Without question, we are living in a time of great ecological and environmental degradation, but what has been exciting to me lately about that fact is the opportunity that creates for us to get creative and execute extraordinary restoration projects on large scales. It is not a frontier per se. I mean, people have been improving the land and have improved it many times throughout history, but in some ways, it is a novel frontier. There has hardly been a time in human history with more opportunity to restore and enrich large swaths of land, but with a whole different level of economic and social complication, not to mention a whole different level of environmental urgency. The people who can see the opportunity, who want to live in a verdant, rich, lush world and are willing to take on all those layers of complexity will be a new brand of trailblazer, one who in the future should be worthy of significant celebration. You know, your name and lights and stuff, like low energy LED ones, of course. These relationships and crossroads, intersections between large scale land restoration and agriculture, all of that is of great interest to me right now. And since you all end up going on whatever journeys I decide to end up going on, get excited to explore some of these further and in more specific ways and how they may relate to your own land, community, climate, farming methods, gardening methods, all that stuff. And to be clear, I know this sounds like I'm just kind of looking for permaculture or restoration agriculture or even regenerative agriculture ideas. And sure, that can be part of it. But I guess what I'm excited about is projects that bring life back to large areas and whole communities and what there is to be learned from that as a small scale grower and I don't know, just as a citizen. Anyway, like many of you did last week, drop the exciting land restoration projects you've come across in the comments section. I know there are ecologists that follow the show. I'd love to hear from you all, or possibly you've seen restoration projects that you know of that haven't succeeded. And I'd love to hear about those as well. There are often just as many lessons in failures as in successes. So otherwise, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about water pH as any normal podcast would do on Tilth Tuesday. BRB. Coffee, coffee, coffee.
Hey, this is Zoe with Sterling Flower Farm in Sterling, Connecticut, in eastern Connecticut. Our season's growing really well. We are harvesting like crazy right now, growing commercial cut flowers on about an acre. So yeah, lots of blooms.
Today's episode is brought to you by Farmhand. If you're listening to this, you probably found 5 rare minutes to breathe, but what got pushed back further down the to-do list to make that happen? If it's your CSA newsletter, you're not alone. Farmhand's new newsletter builder was made for busy farmers. It automates weekly emails, drives add-on sales, and makes it easy to keep your customers in the loop without spending hours behind a screen. It launches this summer, but our listeners can request early access now. Visit farmhand.partners/no-till. That's farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere the questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes to us from Patreon member Lettuce, and I thought Frost was an apropos farm name. Anyway, Lettuce writes, quote, pH question. After a soil test last year that revealed high pH and low iron, sulfur treatment was recommended during a tillage event to address pH and the iron problem. I applied about 50% of the recommended dose of sulfur to my beds. I did not observe much change in pH this spring. I don't till much except to turn in winter rye cover crop, thus my reluctance to apply a full dose of sulfur. Last summer, because of monitoring a small swimming pool, I discovered our water has a high pH. So when I water, I guess I'm resetting the pH back to its high level of 8 or 7.5. Short of building infrastructure to collect rainwater for irrigation, how do I get a change in pH, end quote. Okay, so great and interesting question here. Thank you, Lettuce. Now, I will give my thoughts on this, but also I hesitate to engage too much with hyper-specific soil chemistry questions because this stuff is just really complicated and I don't want to screw up your gardens. And also, without knowing exactly where you are and what your soil conditions are that you're working with there, your climate, those sorts of things, it's going to be a little hard to give a perfect answer. So I guess my first recommendation would be to present this exact question to the original agronomist who recommended the sulfur, just to be sure. That said, here are some things to consider about pH in soil and water. So first, water with a high pH can negatively affect nutrient availability in your soils. So if you can address the source of that water, then you should do so. I'm not sure that what the water source is here in this particular instance, but it is relatively common that, for instance, well waters can have high or low pH readings. Now, at least in that case, in the case of a well, you have a built-in reservoir, the well itself, to work with that you could theoretically adjust. It would be harder if using county water that comes from a source directly to a spigot because there is no reservoir to adjust, but rather just a steady as needed stream. There are several acids, including citric acid and carbonic acid, which are considered like organic compliant. That could help adjust the pH. But again, and by the sounds of it, I doubt you would, don't just wing it with this sort of stuff. Even the organically permitted acids like the ones that I mentioned there can wind up causing other issues. So you're going to want an agronomist's opinion here for sure. The typical approach to irrigation water pH balancing is acid injection, but again, I'm going to pass on the recommendations for this one as it is outside of my comfort zone or knowledge area, really. Will water pH change soil pH? It definitely can, and especially in a production context that can have significant impacts, or especially in a case where your soil pH is already high and then you're adding water with a high pH to that. The pH can certainly shift. Of course, pH can significantly alter the available nutrients, as I said, in the soil, thus your iron deficiency. So it's definitely something that needs to be at the top of mind. Growing plants like cover crops, compost, good soil organic matter, and decompacting soil can all help stabilize pH and buffer it from acid or alkaline additions to some extent. But as long as you are adding that water in sizable quantities, you are probably likely going to be battling the same issue for a while. Anyway, I know that's not super helpful as an answer, but consulting with an agronomist is what I would probably do myself in that situation. So that is what I will recommend. The good news is, all is not lost and it can be fixed with some work. Otherwise, I will allow others to feel free to add their insight and experiences in this vein in the comments section, which we can get back to on Friday. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about melons. Be right back.
Jesse Julie here from Pearl Girl Farm in Seneca, South Carolina. Just want to say thank you for all that you do for farmers, and I just want to say shout out to South Carolina Cut Flower Growers Marketing Cooperative, bringing flower farmers together to sell to florists throughout the state. Also, we grow 39 varieties throughout the year, throughout the seasons. Right now, we're finishing up Lysianthus, and then we're on to Amaranth, and from there on, it'll be Heirloom Mums. Thank you, Jesse.
Hi Farmer Jessie, this is Jo at Muddy Puddles Farm. I'm in the UK, and thanks to your advice I've got this garden starting up ready for next year, and it's got its first little cover crop, which is buckwheat and phacelia, coming up just now, so it's going to be really ready to go next year.
All right, so for some of you, you've already been picking melons for a bit, and for others, you're not quite there yet. For others still, it's winter, so there's that. Anyway, we're going to talk about both muskmelons, cantaloupes, and honeydew types, as well as watermelons, but the approach is a little bit different for each. It can be hard to know when to pick a certain melon for a few reasons. One, not all of them change color when they ripen. That would be helpful, like a pepper does or a tomato does, though some of the melons do. Muskmelons more dramatically perhaps than watermelons. Two, it can be hard to know when they are done growing and have reached full size based on their glamour shots in the seed catalogs. And three, people will sometimes tell you to do things like bang on them, which is not generally helpful, though there is research that suggests ripe melons do have a different frequency than underripe melons, and you can even buy devices that help determine peak ripeness within 95 to 97% by listening to the sound the melon makes when you tap on it. Much harder to do as a human, though, with just using your ears without substantial practice, but let's start first with muskmelons and then move to watermelons in terms of determining their ripeness and readiness. With muskmelons, as it is with watermelons, if you leave them on the vine for too long, the result is overripeness. So assuming you want the melon to get as ripe as possible without turning cloyingly sweet and or exploding, here's my approach on muskmelons. Generally with muskmelons, depending on the variety, you get a slight change in color when they ripen. The green on the outside turns a kind of light creamy brown. Some might get a little yellow, but some sort of color and or texture change will generally occur, to at least to a small extent, as they near ripeness, and that is when you are good to start checking for other little clues. The easiest clue, and again speaking strictly for muskmelons here, is when you pick up the melon, does it just pop off the vine or does it need some encouragement? If the latter, like it needs encouragement, it's probably not quite there yet. That doesn't mean you can't pick it or that it won't be tasty when you eat it. It just means that it's not at its peak and may take a few days to fully mature to the right texture. They don't really get all that much sweeter off the vine, but they do kind of change texture a little bit. Smell is also a great indicator. If it's not too hard on your back to get down close to the vine and smell the stem, that is where you should smell ripe, fresh melon. If not, or if it smells a little green, it's also probably not quite there yet. There's also ways to see the ripeness. At maturity, muskmelons begin to break free of their stem, called the abscission zone, and you can tell when the stem is beginning to separate from the melon itself. It kind of pops out a little bit. And that's often when you can smell that ripeness the best. But that's really it for muskmelons. We usually just go through the field and pick the ones whose colors has changed a bit and who pop off the vine the most easily without too much struggle. And for the most part, that results in delicious melons. Now, for watermelons, typically what happens, again, depending on the variety, is that the color will start to change slightly as they get closer to ripeness. Usually more like the glossiness kind of converts to more mattedness. Then I use one indicator. That's pretty much it, the tendril. For the melons we grow, this is pretty much foolproof. Basically, follow the stem of the melon down to the main vine where it is connected. Right there on the other side of the main vine should be a tendril. If the tendril is green and curly, the melon is surly. If it's brown, scarf it down. Okay, maybe that's not like a thing people say, but it is a thing people could say. Just going to try and start a trend here today. If that melon tendril closest to the stem is dry and brown, then that is the best indicator for me that the melon is ripe. As long as everything else is in good working order, the melon is large, it's kind of a little bit of that matted color, all those things. So if it's brown and dry, I know that I can go ahead and cut that stem and harvest that melon. I don't bang on them or anything like that. I know some people do that. It's not necessary for the melons that we grow. And it's really hard to tell much, in my opinion, from the sound. Not saying it isn't fun or that some people, especially larger scale growers who harvest a lot of melons, can tell what's up with the ripeness. But I just find that the slight change in texture, color, and the dry tendril is pretty solid enough evidence for me, and it's just basically foolproof. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and melon methods, and otherwise, that's it for this Tuesday. Remember that tomorrow we will go live at 9 a.m. on our YouTube, and you podcast listeners will get to hear it later in the day, at our usual 1:30 Eastern time. So yeah, bring your questions. That will be our 200th episode too, so bring the appropriate celebration attire as well. I don't know what that is, but I will leave that to you. Don't forget, No-Till Growers is now officially a nonprofit 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That's genuinely like a really great way to help us out, so we appreciate that. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors, and if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and the team at No-Till Growers for their support. Also shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a hat or a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of July, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Anthony Fulton. Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. All right. So as you will remember, a mysterious customer has asked our farmer friend at the farmer's market to come consult with them on their own property, and that our farmer friend could bring someone to help. Suddenly, the gated entrance to the mysterious customer's farm slowly opens. When they get there, it's sort of giant gates swing open and they drive in. To be clear, the vibe that our farmer friend gets from this mysterious customer isn't bad exactly. It's just kind of unique, different, odd. Not like anyone they'd ever met, and yet somehow deeply familiar. And when they pull up to the house, they are surprised at how modest it is. Solar panels line the roof of what appears to be like a 2-bedroom cabin. The mysterious customer is a bit older, so they don't move very fast, but greets the farmers outside and offers to show them the property and what exactly the mysterious farmer needs consulting on. So they hop into a golf cart and they sort of just like buzz down the road into this like small sort of wooded area of trees. And as they're driving, both the farmers sort of look at each other and they kind of mouth to each other like, what is that smell? Silently, of course, they're not trying to be rude, but what is that smell? That is for Thursday. We're probably not going to do any continuation of the story tomorrow. We're going to do that on Thursday because tomorrow we'll be live and that would be hard to do. Anyway, yeah, we'll see you tomorrow for the live show at 9 a.m. Eastern. Thank you all for watching and or listening. We'll see you then. Bye.